everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. Now today's video is going to be a wrap up of my March/April reads, so just what I've recently been reading. So I have 7 books to talk about, so I thought I'd get a big coffee to help me along the way. So I have been working today and hence why my hair looks a bit of a mess, because I was planning to have a shower and do some kind of skincare regime stuff, but then I thought I want to film this. I apologise if you can hear noises banging in the background. We have builders in at the moment and this is the only time in the day when I finish at lunchtime on a Thursday to film before it's crazy and everybody's in the house. So that's my debrief over with. Let's get into the books. So the first book I want to talk about is Kink, which has been edited by Garth Greenwell and R.O. Kwon. And this is it's getting a little more comfortable now. This is a series of short stories around the concept of kink. And there are different variants of kink in this collection. I thought it was a really interesting collection because it's very bold and unapologetic in its style. It has a host of very famous authors. Roxane Gay is in this collection. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. There was quite a few very well known. Obviously Garth Greenwell helped edit this, and the concept was about creating a collection that really spoke to people's sexuality and in particular their interest in the theme of kink in their sexuality and how that's addressed in a plethora of different ways. So there are straight couples discussed in this collection, there are homosexual, bisexual, transsexual, I believe. I might be wrong there, but I thought there was. But anyway, a whole spectrum of different sexualities and gender identities are discussed in this collection. I remember the only criticism that I personally had of this collection is there was a lot of stories that emphasised the theme of sexual exploration around spitting. And apparently for some people that's a kink. There was a lot of references in these stories to people spitting in each other's mouths. Now, I presume most people don't like that. I just have always, since a young child, anybody that spits or anything to do with phlegm, or people, as we say in the northwest, that gauze, which is where they can get phlegm in their mouth and they spit it out and spit it on other people, really makes me severely uncomfortable. So reading it was very triggering for me. I just felt so uncomfortable reading those bits, but that is just a personal thing. I'm sure some people are not as squeamish about those particular things as I was. But aside from that minor criticism, I thought the way that the stories were explored was really interesting, and there were so many things that I didn't really appreciate. And kink is a really interesting topic in terms of sexuality, because kink seems to be at odds with, particularly as a woman, our perception of feminism, because of this whole submissive, dominant personality types in sex. There is a belief that obviously the woman embraces the submissive role, and that it's that kind of sex plays against women. I think this book was very empowering to women, to people of different gender and sexual identities. So I found that quite interesting, because recently in a lot of books that I've read, kink has been shown as a way to manipulate and to control the other person in the relationship. And that in books like Normal People and in The Dream House, those were 2 examples of when kink and sex and those themes were used as a way for the character to self-punish. So Carmen Maria Machado engaged in sexual relationships with her significant other as a way of punishing herself that she describes in that memoir. And Marianne asks people to be violent with her during sex as a way to punish herself and a self-loathing thing instead of a loving thing. And I've seen a lot online that people who are of these kink communities, I saw a video on television about how a lady expressed, it was on a Netflix program, that it's a self-love thing, and it's the relationship between people in dom and sub relationships is very much on communication and both people enjoying it and both having that safe space and not for it to be abusive, which is stereotypically how it is seen. So I thought that was interesting, that this book really opened my eyes that to some people this isn't a weird psychoanalytic choice from their childhood. We don't have to therapize everybody in their decision to be interested in kink. Sometimes it is an expression of love, and that the people who engage in these sexual relationships have a lot more autonomy than is perceived in the media and other literature. So I think this is a homage to kink and showing the world that it's not quite as scary as generally perceived. So I really enjoyed it anyway. I feel like I've waffled on a little bit about this book. So I give it 4 stars, and I think it's a very fresh collection of stories. And I think if you like short stories or you want to read more and you're interested in the style of kink and that play and how those short stories would be done, then I recommend reading it just to satisfy your curiosity on that one. And then I read An Eye for an Eye by Carol Wire. Now this is the first in a new detective series, so apparently this author has done 2 other detective series with multiple books in them. And this one is the first in the DCI Kate Young series. So this was quite nostalgic to read in places because it talks a lot about Stoke, and then it mentioned Keele University, and then it mentioned Derby, and I'm currently doing my Masters online with Derby University, and I went to Keele University for my undergraduate degree and know Stoke quite well. So I obviously lived around the Stoke, Newcastle-under-Lyme area for 3 years. So it was quite interesting because I've never really read any books that mirrored where I've been and places and things that I know quite that way before. So that was quite interesting. But this book was a little bit clunky for me. I've seen some really good reviews on Goodreads. I think a lot of people really enjoyed this book, but I had a few issues with it. I just want to mention as well, I've just forgotten, which I always do, Kink and this book and quite a few others I got from NetGalley as ebook review copies. So Kink was definitely one of them, and Eye for an Eye was as well, and I'll mention the others when I get to them. But back to the review, it's coming back to me now. So this book followed Kate, who returned to work after there was a trauma and she had to go off work for a while because there was a murder spree killer on a train, and she was one of the police officers that turned up on the scene, and she had a lot of trauma, and so they invited her back in. She recently lost her father, and there is a father-like figure in the police who was very close to her dad, who's encouraging her to come back, and people around her aren't really sure if that's the right choice to be making. Then she is put on this murder investigation case where murder victims keep being found in their home with bits of apple that they have choked on, and they have found out that this killer is using a machine that forces their mouth open, and then they are being choked to death with pieces of apple. And then the more she investigates this murder, like all cliches in thriller books, she finds out that it connects to her past, and the more she roots into this story, the more it seems to connect with what happened with the spree killing when she first went off. I don't want to give too many spoilers away because this is the first in a new series, So one of the twists, which was meant to be a bit more of a shock later down the line, there was too many obvious crumbs left very early on that meant that you already knew shock horror, that one coming. And the second twist and reveal wasn't quite as big as it could have been. I think this writer can certainly write. I just think this wasn't the most impressive thriller that I've read recently. And it was just what I would consider an okay thriller. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, but I don't want to linger too much on it because I don't want to give any spoilers for this one. But I've also realised that I had to look down at my phone multiple times to remember the plot, so that might give you some indication of how it just wasn't overall that memorable for me. But then the next one is The Women Who Transformed Journalism by Liz Hodgkinson. So apparently this was published in 2008 and then just got republished on NetGalley, so I also got a NetGalley proof of this book, and I was a little bit disappointed in this one. I think it was quite informative in terms of explaining how women have really improved and left a legacy in the career field of journalism, and it did go into different elements of journalism which I did like. It talked about the big papers and how women have staked their way into the big papers by being CEOs, chief editors, column writers, horoscope writers, how they've done sports and war zones and different elements of journalism, which I did find really interesting. But the style was just very repetitive, and what it tended to do was be very heavily biography focused, so it would just throw so much information. This person, where they died, how many kids they had, who they married, what they did, and then it would go to the next paragraph and it would be another person, how many kids they had, which paper they worked for. It was very jarring. They threw a lot of people in at very surface level, and then we went on to the next thing. So it was just too much biography, not enough narrative non-fiction, not enough story. It was just a lot of facts. This person had learnt a lot and wanted to tell you a lot, but they didn't tell you a story as such. It didn't have a cohesiveness to it. So it made for more dry than engaging reading, in my opinion. So I just gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars because I don't really think many people will read it and enjoy it. I think you might get something from it, but I don't think you will enjoy it. So unfortunately, that's that. Then the next one I read was also a NetGalley proof, and that was Land of Big Numbers by T. Ping Chen. And this was such a good short story collection. I ended up giving it 4.5/5 out of 5 stars. I thought the concept and the stories were brilliant. I didn't have any story I disliked, so I think for a short story collection, if you like all of them, or pretty much all of them, then it will get into the top echelon of your voting criteria, because short stories are very hard overall as a genre to impress people. And I have experimented with short stories for quite a few years now, and I know that I like a more realist style of story. The more magical realism, or the more abstract, or the more airy-fairy that the short story collection is, the less tangible the plot is, the less I'm going to enjoy it. So this had some very grounded stories that I personally really appreciated. So one thing that impressed me about this short story collection was it was just beautiful. The language was absolutely stunning, and I know that's a cliche that people say a lot, but I remember reading it and thinking, oh my god, this is beautiful. And I do like a bit of flowery language, but I also like when writers are so talented that they don't have to give you overly flowery language to give you beautiful language and captivating sentences. And there was parts of these short stories I wanted to read out loud because it was a satisfying experience to read those sections. This collection deals with the topic of China. It's history, its politics. It also deals with Chinese immigration to America and mixed identity, but it's really dealing with the topic of China and modern China and what that means. It deals with relationships between people, and a lot are between lovers and fathers and parents, and one of the standout stories is about a group of workers who are on a train. They're at a train station and the train has been cancelled, and they end up living for months in the train station because due to government regulations they cannot leave the train station, but this train doesn't come, and it talks about them creating this inner community within the train station and how people in the outside areas of China could see them on the television, and they created this almost union. And that was a very strong story, and I think a lot of people have referenced that in their Goodreads reviews. That was one of the standout stories, but it had a gentleness at the same time as being very strong. It wasn't a very bold collection of stories, it was probably very understated, but it had some very insightful things to say about China, its politics, its culture, particularly its culture and its history are really interesting to me personally, but also interesting in this story because I think using the American context as well and how Americans perceive the Chinese in light of things like Trump and his just xenophobia against China, how China is one of those cultures that is very prominently different to Western culture, like American and British culture. It's really interesting to see that played out and to understand that there is cultural significance in why Chinese individuals behave or in a certain way, or they dress in a certain way, or they see things in a certain way. And I think it's beautifully done in this collection, and it's a celebration of China that I really appreciated. It also shows some issues in China, politics being complicated in that country as well. So it really fascinated me. This whole collection was fascinating, and I'm so glad I read it, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then the next one I read was Bluebird by Attica Locke. This is the first in that series. I know Heaven My Home is the second one that's out, and I don't think as of yet there's any more in the collection out. I thoroughly enjoyed this story. It's kind of a bit of a western. It's not really, but it follows Darren, who's Darren Matthews or Mathers, I can't remember off the top of my head, who's a Texas Ranger, and he's an African-American Texas Ranger, and his uncle before him was the very first African-American Texas Ranger, and his uncle before him dies, and he's got a second uncle who's remarried his other uncle's wife, bit complicated, and I think his dad is dead and his mum's an alcoholic, so he kind of was raised by his two uncles. And at the beginning of the story, he's having relationship issues with his wife because she does not want him to continue being part of the Texas Rangers. She wants him to leave the Rangers and retrain in law, which his other uncle, the one who's still living, does for a living. I think he's a professor of law. And they both kind of want to conspire against Darren and get him into that career field. But there's something about the badge that really appeals to Darren. And so it's set in the south of America. I forgot what the place is called now. I've forgotten the actual location, but he is currently off duty with the Rangers because there's been an incident in his hometown where he lives, where he's seen to have been helping somebody who had a vendetta against a man that ends up turning up dead a few days after an altercation happened between another man. So a friend of Darren's, who's also African American, threatens a white man who they believe belongs to the Aryan Brotherhood because he was trying to have a relationship, have a fling with the African American man's granddaughter. But then the Aryan Brotherhood man ends up turning up dead in a ditch a few days later, and obviously the African American man is seen as the main suspect, and then Darren gets thrown into it, and then because of his connection and him turning up to defuse a situation a few days earlier, he's seen as suspicious, so he's now temporarily off the Texas Rangers job. Then his other friend, who has connections to cases, has told him that there seems to be a really strange situation in another state along, another little deadbeat town. It's a really small town. That a white woman and a black man have been found dead in a few days gap of each other, and that he should go undercover and find out what's happening, because it seems to be suspicious, and there seems to be an underlying link that potentially race is an issue there. And Darren mentions a lot in this series he's very motivated by hate crime, and it looks to be a hate crime, and he should go investigate. So that's basically what happens. But I found the southern charm of this book really interesting. I really got into it. I really liked that it's completely different for a thriller. It's not police procedural. It has this western vibe to it, you know, the southern landscape, the southern community spirit, and also the community racism in the South. And the demarcations between the races are a lot more prominent in the South of America than the North, with, you know, the very difficult history in the South, and this Aryan Brotherhood was a really interesting angle for this story to go as well, to bring race into it. But it was very viscerally written. You could smell the pies in the diner, and you could see the landscape really clearly. You could imagine these people, and I loved having the protagonist as African American and a Texas Ranger. I just think this is a really fresh, interesting series. It also interweaves with a lot of commentary on race and where America is. I think it's very insightful. A lot of it was written in a very profound way. I read a few chapters and instantly knew that me and this book were very much going to get along, and I was going to continue with the series because I just found it so enjoyable. I got really immersed in it. I think the thriller itself was done very well, and I didn't find any loopholes or anything that concerned me. So I'm very happy to continue with the series, and I gave the book 4 out of 5 stars. And then the penultimate book on this list is Blue Monday by Nikki French, which is the first in the Frida Klein series. And this was quite interesting because so many people on BookTube have absolutely raved about the Frida Klein series. Jen Campbell loves it. April from Getting Hooga with it loves it. And I enjoyed this book and it won me over in the end, but it was not what I expected. I think because of how old it is now, which is a very loose term, but I think it was 2011 maybe, or maybe a little bit earlier. I can't remember because the copy's upstairs, but the style of thriller writing in general was slightly different, and it does have this nostalgic feel to it that I did kind of enjoy. But one thing that I find really interesting is a lot of people complain about coincidence and how they don't like that in stories, particularly some people that raved about this series. And I think a few things were very much hinged on coincidence or a framing of situations that just seemed to be a little bit too good to be true, which I find quite interesting because a lot of people seem to be very forgiving of that in this series. They've been critical of it in others. So it's very interesting. For example, Frida Klein gets herself kind of invested in the police investigation about this missing boy in this particular book, and she does things that are quite questionable. At one point she is due to have a formal warning with the police, and she manages to get out of that. She breaks confidentiality and a lot of trust with patients very early on in this book, considering she is a qualified psychotherapist. And considering that's a career field that I want to go into, I was reading this in a lot of discomfort about how she dealt with certain patients, particularly the main patient that she has in this story, who gets very much invested in the story, thrust into the story, if you will, because the plot hinges heavily around him. Alan, I think his name was. The way she deals with him and the things that she discloses to the police, that some things are valid and some things she shouldn't really have broken confidentiality for, in my opinion. And the way that she then just starts leading this investigation on her own when she's not qualified to do so, it's very interesting. I think maybe you kind of just have to put the disbelief on the back burner to enjoy this series. No one's saying that this was a realistic depiction of these career fields and of this series in any way resembles real life in any way. But I just found it quite interesting because I was reading some bits thinking, oh, really? Oh, really? And I've been discussing it with Laura. We've done a buddy read. I will link her down below. And she said that she did see some things coming, but that she had a similar experience to me where we just enjoyed reading it. And once you got to halfway through, you did have a desire to keep reading it. So I'm definitely going to continue with the series. I have all the books upstairs. I think maybe it might be one of those series where it just gets better and better, and therefore the stumbling blocks of maybe this first book get ironed out quite well in the next few, and it's forgiven for that. But I don't know, I've just been comparing it in my mind a little bit to the Cormoran Strike books, which I think was so good and very strong from the beginning. And I feel like it has a lot of nostalgic overlap with that, and I think if I get into the right lane with this series, it will feel the same way and I will enjoy it as much. But yeah, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because it was just not really hitting that mark for me. But I'm in a very forgiving mood with this series, and I will definitely continue and see how I get on. And then the last one that I read was Consent by Vanessa Springora. And this is a memoir about her experiences. She's French and this has been translated. This also was a NetGalley read and a NetGalley proof. Obviously Blue Monday and Bluebird, I had my own copies. Bluebird I got from the library, and Blue Monday I had my own copy, but the rest of the books were all NetGalley approved ebook proofs. So yes, this has been translated from the French into English, and it's a memoir about the author's experience of grooming, sexual abuse, and being entrapped by what we can only describe as a paedophile. So this book was a bit of an education for me in terms of French society. This book deals with beliefs in the 70s in France, which apparently were a lot more liberal than here in this country. And in particular, this book hinges on how a lot of people's opinion about sexual relationships, particularly between an adult and what we would consider a minor, was a lot more forgiving. Now, that's not for me to assume what the beliefs were in this particular country or any other country. I'm certain that this is an issue that is international and worldwide, and that every culture has had dealings with this kind of adult-minor relationship. What's really interesting in this book is the man himself tries to educate Vanessa by giving her loads of references of when an adult and a minor have married and it's been seen as socially acceptable. So he's playing constantly with manipulating her mind to imagine that it is normal. And we've all heard of rock stars marrying 13-year-olds, and he mentions a lot about the Greek and the Roman marriage setup in ancient times, and how we are not as liberal as we should be, and particularly the French bourgeoisie and the French celebrity and intellectual circles seem to be very forgiving about adult and minor relationships. So this particular man, Gabriel Matzef, was a famous writer apparently, and he was taking experiences he was having with young women and pretty much verbatim putting them into novels, claiming they were literature and selling them, is kind of what Vanessa's addressing in this book. That she found out later in life that excerpts from her diaries, experiences she'd had with him, had very loosely been edited and then thrown into a book. He mentions going to Thailand and having relationships that he's paid for with 13-year-old boys, 10-year-old boys. She finds out that he's been having relationships with other women. She's considered historically one of his youngest partners, who he has sexual relations with, and she's 14 and he was in his 50s, I think. She does mention him being in his 50s at some point when she was having a sexual relationship with him. And so this really educated me, because it mentions in the book how Vanessa says that there was bills and letters that quite famous French people were endorsing alongside him about a more liberal attitude between minors and adults. So by no means this isn't a criticism of French culture in any way, and I know that no country has a squeaky clean relationship with any issues, let alone issues with minors. I know that in this country we've had a lot of issue with people, celebrities, footballers having relations with minors and not knowing because they were able to get into clubs even though they weren't of legal age. So there's always been a controversy around minors and adults, and it's not a criticism of French culture. I just found it quite interesting to know that particularly in France, which here in the UK we see them as more liberal on a lot of different things than us, because we have the stereotype of being very buttoned up sexually and culturally, liberally in general. But I found that quite interesting that she went into that detail and explained that the way her relationship was seen at the time in the 70s was reflective of how people saw minor and adults' relationships. She mentions her mum at first not being happy with the relationship but getting to a place where she accepted it. And I found that really interesting, just because in the context that I'm in now, if I had brought back somebody of that age, that would never have been acceptable. And somebody would have probably contacted the police. But I'm living in a different time period with different expectations. So reading it with the lens of living in 2021 now was quite interesting, that her mother and other people in society seemed to accept it. They knew he was notorious for having these relationships with minors, and there wasn't a criticism, there wasn't an effect on his career, on his livelihood, which was very interesting and obviously frustrating to read. But this book was so powerful for me. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars because it really reminded me of Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I think it's just as good. It's really dealing with her coming to terms in her adult life with what she went through, and because she felt like she consented at the time, she didn't allow herself to see herself as a victim. And I think it has a great overlap with Chanel Miller's memoir, because she was intoxicated at the time of her sexual assault. She for a long time didn't see herself as a victim, and she thought she was to blame. So this book is called Consent, and I think it is very interesting how Vanessa goes into that and talks about how just because a minor at the time seems to consent to a sexual relationship, it is still exploitation of said minor, and that is not consent. And she really goes to the heart of that grey area and tries to clear up these discrepancies and where we're going wrong when we use the word consent, because she's almost mentioning in this memoir that consent isn't this criteria that we've now made it legally, where once they have consent it's fine. Because although she had verbal consent and she had a consensual relationship with him, it was abuse. And I think that's so interesting because there's a lot of people of different generations to myself who seem to not understand that concept. When you see on media and TV, when a woman goes to the bar, goes to a club, meets a man, they get a bit frisky, and she goes back to the house of a man, and then she decides to say no to sex. The amount of people who will argue the idea that she had it coming and that he almost had a right to assert himself and to try and put himself on the woman and almost rape the woman, because why would she go back to his flat if she didn't know the intention was sex? And I find that it's so crazy that people believe that just because a woman has gone back to his house, a man is entitled to take sex from a woman, to rape her, because she was giving the signals. That is rape, and that is sexual assault. I just find that we all need a re-education on this, and this book is really interesting because it's going into that grey area that people would like to assume is consent, and it's not. So yeah, it just blew me away. I found it just a really, really interesting read. It's a great companion piece, I think, to Know My Name. So I think if you loved Know My Name by Chanel Miller, you'll really enjoy this because it's that same discussion, and it's adding, I think, to the canon of non-fiction that we need on these topics of sexual assault and abuse, and we need these core texts. Since last year and a lot of things came out about Weinstein, I just find it so important that these non-fictions, these stories are told, not buried, because we really need to set a precedence and a canon of non-fiction, of fiction, of literature in general on this topic, so that we never ever forget and we never ever get complacent and we grow from this. So I thought it was amazing. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So finally, that is everything. That's all 7 books wrapped up for you guys. Thank you guys so much for being patient and watching it till the end, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.